Peace and pugilism. Fight fanatics is Myron Magnus in another segment of Boxing Logics United. Here is the much anticipated film study. Video 1 of a 3-video series of the controversial match between Gary Russell Jr., the 6-year reigning WBC featherweight champion, versus the number 2 contender Mark MAGSAYO of the Philippines. And why it's controversial? Because Gary Russell Jr. lost for the first time in over 6 years to Mark MAGSAYO. A fight where he let us know that he had an injury going into the fight, which we all found out was the right shoulder. Okay? But it's been much rhetoric, I should say, going on post-fight and during the fight that Mark MAGSAYO kind of dominated Gary Russell Jr. and that Gary Russell Jr. ran, especially after the shoulder injury was revealed to us in the 4th round. But here is round 1, and as we could see right there, Gary Russell Jr. takes a headbutt from Mark MAGSAYO. Note that, because later on you will see the effects of that at the end of this round. But Gary Russell Jr. is holding the real estate in the center of the ring. He's not running. He is actually going toe-to-toe. Right there he lands a straight left on Mark MAGSAYO. And this is a fight where the new up-and-coming Mark MAGSAYO, which is a very young, talented fighter, and I expect him to do a lot of good things in the future. But it's not his time yet. And Gary Russell Jr. shows a masterful boxing display in this fight that should be considered one of the best boxing displays in the history of the sport, because he fights 8 rounds with one arm, literally. As you can see right now already, Gary Russell Jr. is doing nothing but throwing the jab out there, controlling the real estate. He's pawing it, trying to establish distance. And you see he's pretty much moving Mark MAGSAYO back whenever he chooses. Right there he slips a right from Mark MAGSAYO. Those 2 rights out there. Mark MAGSAYO throws 2 lefts. Gary Russell throws out the jab. The right hand arm that will be eventually slowed down after 8 rounds. Now there you can see where Gary Russell Jr. from the headbutt is getting swelling around his left eye. We on to the 2nd round. Mark MAGSAYO throws a body blow to the body that's partially blocked by the elbows of Gary Russell. He tries to throw a left up top, miss. Swing a left, Gary Russell slips it, throws a left body shot. Gary Russell throws a right. Gary Russell steps in, throws a straight left to Mark MAGSAYO that rocks him back a little bit. Mark MAGSAYO comes with another uppercut to the body, partially blocked by the elbows of Gary Russell Jr. Gary Russell Jr. is throwing a jab out there, and he's pushing Mark MAGSAYO back. See, one of the narratives that was pushed during this entire fight, there's Gary Russell Jr. slipping and ducking the overhand right from Mark MAGSAYO, was that there's Gary Russell Jr. throwing a straight left and a clash of the heads again. Of course, if you don't know, Gary Russell Jr. is a southpaw and Mark MAGSAYO is orthodox. For the casual fans, southpaw means a fighter that leads with his right hand, and orthodox is a fighter who leads with the left. There is Gary Russell Jr. slipping the left 2 times, and I put that in slow motion to accent it. Now here's Gary Russell doing this Ultra Instinct display that he learned from Goku. Boom, boom. 5 punches by Mark MAGSAYO that miss. Mark MAGSAYO has not got a flush shot yet on Gary Russell Jr., where Gary Russell Jr. has landed about 2, at least 3 flush, and right there was 1. Also note, much of the time during this fight, the back of Mark MAGSAYO was facing the camera and oftentimes blocking a good view of the punches that was coming from Gary Russell's side, as you see in the slow motion clip earlier. There's Mark MAGSAYO. Mark MAGSAYO, they both standing toe to toe. Mark MAGSAYO is having difficulty finding range on Gary Russell Jr. and getting in. Mark MAGSAYO comes looping right, slips and ducks by Gary Russell. But many people, and especially the commentators, was very much hyping up the first 1, 2, 3, and 4th round. Mark MAGSAYO there hesitant on how to go in. Gary Russell Jr. is holding the center of the ring, not going anywhere. And one of the narratives you're going to hear is that Gary Russell Jr. was running. Whereas you see, he's in the center of the ring. There's a straight left. Mark MAGSAYO comes in with the lower body punch. Mark MAGSAYO gets pushed back by that straight left by Gary Russell Jr. though. Gary Russell Jr. is in the center of the ring. They're toe to toe. Gary Russell left. Mark MAGSAYO comes with a swooping right that grazes the face. And that's the end of the 2nd round. Both rounds so far to Gary Russell. There is another clash of heads. There's Mark MAGSAYO coming with the right, blocked by the gloves. Tries the looping underhand uppercut. Then Gary Russell swings to the right, get away from, blocked by the elbows. Again, Gary Russell is controlling the center of the ring and pushing Mark MAGSAYO back. And keep in mind, Mark MAGSAYO is the bigger fighter. There's Mark MAGSAYO throwing a right, throwing a left to the bottom, don't hit much. Come with a looping left that touches Gary Russell on the side of the head. Looping left, Gary Russell ducks. Russell comes in on the right. Mark MAGSAYO comes back with a straight right and 2 lefts that all miss the shot. One thing you're going to start noticing in this 3 video series that's coming is that Gary Russell Jr. is now soon about to start finding range with the left hand. Because Mark MAGSAYO's fighting style is much like Pacquiao, where he does that bumps and that jump just like that right there. And he's predictable. There he come in right there. Gary Russell meets him with the left. So Gary Russell Jr. is now figuring out his timing. And now you will soon see that straight left start to land with frequency as Mark MAGSAYO tries to come in to attack Gary Russell Jr. Boom, right there. You will see that come often, well into the later rounds and the end of the fight. Mark MAGSAYO is having trouble finding the angles to hit Gary Russell Jr. And keep in mind, it's often that is the case when you're fighting the southpaw. Mark MAGSAYO comes in, miss 2 shots. Gary Russell ducks. Where's the effect? Mark MAGSAYO throws in 2 or 3 more, misses all. Gary counters with the left. Where's the effective aggression that the crowd and the commentators, or should I say the Mark MAGSAYO fans, was talking about. Gary Russell catches him with a left, swoops out. Mark MAGSAYO has not landed a flush punch on Gary Russell at all. Straight left in by Gary. Mark MAGSAYO tries to counter. Gary is out of there. A beautiful boxing display. Round 4. MAGSAYO come in swinging crazy. Swinging, Gary spins him. Gary Russell, you're going to find, especially later on in the next 2 films to come, Gary Russell will be spinning Mark MAGSAYO like a bottle. This is the point where Gary Russell Jr. jabs. Mark MAGSAYO, a counter jab by Gary Russell Jr. after Mark MAGSAYO tried a looping right that jams his arm. But guess what? It doesn't stop Gary Russell Jr. from doing that right there, sticking the left right in his face. Mark MAGSAYO was over pursuing quite often during the match, off balance, and was getting countered by Gary Russell Jr. the entire fight, as we will see. There is again. Mark MAGSAYO comes in. Gary Russell Jr. counters him with the left, and Mark MAGSAYO's left throwing wandering punches, hitting nothing. Now, note Mark MAGSAYO is 23. Here's again. Boom. Another one. Gary Russell Jr. starts to tee off on Mark MAGSAYO. Anytime he comes in to challenge. Jab by Mark MAGSAYO. MAGSAYO throwing 3 punches, all that missed the target. Mark MAGSAYO comes in. Gary slides to the left. Another counter left on Mark MAGSAYO's face. Jab to the top and jab to the body by Gary Russell Jr. Straight left by Gary Russell Jr. See, the fight looks a lot different without the Showtime commentators hyping up the fight, doesn't it? Here's another one. Here we go. Mark MAGSAYO come in. Boom! Ate another one right there. Here it come again. In case you didn't catch it. Look at Mark MAGSAYO's neck. Bam! Clean and effective punches were all landed by Gary Russell Jr., leaving Mark MAGSAYO swinging in the air. There is 4 punches straight lefts by Gary Russell Jr. Mind you, this is after he's already re-aggravated the injury to the right shoulder. He's now in Ultra Instinct mode. Thank you for watching part 1 of this 3 video series. Subscribe, hit the bell icon for all notifications so you could be informed for part 2. Peace and pugilism.